And hi, John. Thank you so much for joining me today as we shine a spotlight on some of the social and ethical issues surrounding genomics. Today, we're going to be looking at public engagement and science communication and the importance of this within genomics. But before we start, John, if you could just introduce yourself and give a little bit about your background as well.
Sure. So I'm a registered genetic counsellor working in the NHS. I work at Addenbrooke's Hospital, and I'm also a researcher at the Society and Ethics Research Group at the Wellcome Genome Campus, where we look into some of the sort of social and ethical aspects of genomics. And one of the things I'm interested in from a research point of view is wider engagement with genomics, and I have a particular interest in the value of genetics and genomics in broader culture, in particular popular culture.
So as a genetic counsellor, what kind of made you want to go into that role?
So I came across it in my undergrad degree when I was studying at UCL, and I thought it looked like a fascinating career, and I thought, well, I'll pursue this until I find something that I want to pursue more, and I sort of never did. I sort of looked into kind of what was needed to apply, and you needed a kind of range, is still the case, really. You need a range of skills, including kind of background and kind of doing sort of social work or care work. So I went away to kind of get the relevant training that I needed to pursue the course, to get into the master's course, and thought, well, I'll just keep doing this, as I said, until something comes along that I want to do more, and nothing ever did. So
genetic counselling obviously is kind of a relatively new kind of field. Why do you think they're so important in terms of like the genomics revolution? Why are genomic counsellors, why is their role like kind of so important in that area?
Well, I think one of the things that genetic counsellors do is they have these sort of twin skills of scientific knowledge and communication and counselling skills, and that's reflected both in the sort of background that you need to get into the course. So in order to become a genetic counsellor, to go onto the master's course, you need a background in both of those, and then those are then reflected in the training you get, and also the kind of continual training you have as a genetic counsellor. And I think in order to kind of maximize the benefits of genomic medicine, you're going to need both of those two things. You're going to need a hard handle on kind of the sort of the science of it. And in terms of things like complex variant interpretation, and understanding the benefits of things like polygenic risk scores and how to apply those and all those sorts of things. But you also need a solid grasp of the kind of the human aspect, the fact that there's always a patient at the end of this, and maximizing the benefit often comes down to those kind of interactions that you're having with patients at the end of the process. As an example, one of the key things in maximizing the knowledge is being able to share that information widely within families. And as I think everybody knows, families are complicated things. Let's say that someone has a diagnostic test and it finds a cancer predisposition gene, and that then needs to be shared more widely with the family to maximize the benefits. Genetic counsellors, with their skill set, are in a prime position to be able to do that. That's nothing new in a sense. That's what genetic counsellors have been doing for many years now. But I think often people are now going to be getting a genetic diagnosis where there's no context for them, because genetic testing is happening, because genomics is becoming mainstream. A lot of the time people are going to be getting these tests and they're going to have no kind of familial context, no emotional context. It's going to be coming right out of the blue. And one of the things that I think it's important to be able to do before you start sharing the information with family is to process what exactly that means for you as well. So I think genetic counsellors are in a really strong position to help people who are having genomic testing in the NHS, especially when they may be trying to make sense of that, the idea of a genetic diagnosis for the very first time.
Yeah, definitely. I think as kind of genomics becomes more integrated and more people are getting genetic tests done, and obviously we're getting better at kind of sequencing as well, particularly like whole genome sequencing. How do you think the role of a genetic counsellor will change in the future?
I think the role of a genetic counsellor going forward is a really interesting question. I think one of the things to consider is that as genetic testing becomes more integrated, not everyone who has genetic testing will need genetic counselling. So I think it's worth separating genetic testing and genetic counselling, because they're two different things. Obviously, a lot of people who have genetic counselling will have genetic testing, but not everyone who has genetic testing will need genetic counselling. So, you know, for example, if perhaps someone is having genetic testing to determine, you know, suitability of certain chemotherapy options, you know, there's not necessarily a need for a genetic counsellor in that point. So I think one challenge to go forward as genomic testing enters mainstream healthcare is to figure out who needs genetic counselling and who's going to benefit from that approach. I think another role of a genetic counsellor going forward is going to be working more within other specialties. So at the minute, clinical genetics tends to be its own speciality, and obviously there are, you know, integrated clinics to a point, but I think that's something we're going to see a lot more genetic counsellors working within different sections, so within oncology or cardiology or ophthalmology, both in terms of talking to patients in those settings, but also then supporting other clinicians perhaps with you know, complex results, variants of uncertain significance, or those sorts of things in variant interpretation. So I think yeah, there's going to be a lot more multidisciplinary team working going forward, genetic counsellors moving away from necessarily the kind of clinical genetics and then kind of going working within other specialties, supporting them as they implement genomic testing.
Yeah. Communication is obviously a critical part of your role. What sort of challenges have you faced in terms of like communicating with patients and also their families ultimately, because anyone kind of receiving a genetic diagnosis is obviously, that result is then going to impact people's families as well.
So there's a kind of a range of challenges that you might face. I guess one within families is thinking about sharing information. And it's pretty rare that people will ever refuse to share information, although it does happen. And there's the court case, the ABC versus St George's court case, which is the kind of famous example recently where a family member refused to share their genetic information, and the family member you know, sued the NHS, arguing that, you know, the clinicians had a duty to disclose that. Those situations are reasonably rare, but you do often encounter you know, complex family dynamics where people think it's going to be hard to share information, or they don't quite know how. They don't quite know how to start that conversation with other family members about genetic diagnosis. I think another challenge is just thinking about the emotional impact of a diagnosis, and allowing people the kind of space and time to process that. And in particular, I think that links to a point of perhaps when you know, people may be coming to a genetic counselling clinic with their own beliefs that may perhaps conflict with, you know, the explanations that kind of we're giving. So, you know, for example, people might be having genetic testing and they might think that they're not at an increased risk because the genetic condition is on their mum's side and they took after the father's side of the family. You know, so you get these situations in clinics where you have lots of different beliefs, both in terms of broader cultural beliefs or more kind of, you know, personal familial beliefs that, you know, people have and are important to them, and may sort of conflict perhaps with a sort of scientific explanation, if you like. And one of the ways that you can kind of help people in those situations is to kind of actually deal with the kind of emotional aspect of it, because we know that if you allow people to express and articulate their emotions, that will just listen to you better, because people, you know, are more likely to listen to you if you listen to them, but also people process factual information better if their emotions have been listened to and acknowledged.
Yeah, as you said, like obviously the public is so diverse in terms of like different obviously beliefs and everything like that. But for example, if I had a genetic test, like I have a genetics background, so I would be able to understand a lot of what you're saying. But how do you do with people who've never even heard of the word genetics or gene, and don't have a clue what you're talking about, essentially? Yeah. How do you adapt your communication skills in that sense?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there's a number of ways you can do that. I think one of the things is to you know, appreciate that there's only a sort of so much information you need. You know, essentially, what's the bottom line? What's the absolute minimum information you need to, you know, make the decision? And there is a temptation sometimes. So genetic counselling back in the late 90s. There was a influential genetic counsellor called Seymour Kessler who identified these kind of two models of genetic counselling that seemed to be in practice. These models were kind of descriptive rather than kind of models that were specifically taught, but he identified the kind of counselling model and the teaching model, and that kind of counselling model would be suggested kind of deals with kind of feelings and emotions and puts the relationship, a kind of therapeutic relationship between counsellor and patient at the heart of the clinical practice. And the teaching model focuses more on this kind of didactic model where you're trying to impart as much information as you can to the patient to allow them to make their own decision. And there's a temptation sometimes when you're kind of operating from a kind of teaching model to think that in order to make the decisions, people need to have as much information as possible, and you kind of go into the kind of teaching mode. But actually, if you listen to patients and really take the time to see where they're coming from, often that gives you a much better idea of kind of actually what's the bottom line here, what's the minimum they need in this situation to make a decision that feels right for them. And you can just kind of scale back the amount of information that you're giving. So that's one way of doing it, is basically just reducing the amount of information that you give and only giving the amount that's really needed for the situation. And I think another thing you can do, is to allow people's knowledges and experiences to come into a clinical consultation. I think this goes as a point for genetic counselling, but also as a point for science communication in general. It feels you need to allow the communication to be two-directional, and that's really important in terms of we often think of science communication as being kind of one directional. I've got the scientific information, I need to give it to you, and we'll judge success by how successfully you manage to kind of take on board all this information. But actually, I think real engagement and also clinical consultations are most successful when there's learning happening on both sides of that. And I think when learning happens on both sides, when both sides have a commitment to learn about each other, you actually get a sense of understanding, sort of meaning making. So thinking about a consultation, instead of thinking about how can I get this person to understand it correctly, I'm thinking, how is this person making sense of the information I'm giving them? What does it mean to them? So if we take that with an example, let's take the example that we've already used of somebody says, oh, I'm not worried about this gene change because I take after my father's side, that's on my mother's side. And a temptation might that in a clinical consultation might be to kind of think, well, they need to know this is Mendelian inheritance. It doesn't matter which side you take after, the odds are 50-50 or whatever. But actually what you can hear there is actually the emotion, what's it going to mean for them if they have inherited it? What's the emotional impact going to be? What's the relationship like with the members of the family who they do or they don't take after? What's the emotional context? And once you start to make sense of that, you start to make sense of what the result is going to mean in that context. You understand how they're making sense of the situation that they're in. I think that's kind of one way forward, is to kind of approach it not through a kind of process of I've got this information that I have to give to you. It's more of a case of we need to make sense of this together, and really see that dialogue as going both. Well, this dialogue would go both ways rather than kind of one way.
Yeah, no, definitely. Obviously, everyone's different, and you have to communicate to people differently. But listening to them, as you said, and just kind of keeping that dialogue open is really important. So you also work at the Society and Ethics Research Group at the Wellcome Genome Campus. Would you be able to kind of explain a little bit about that and kind of the research that you guys do there?
Yes, so we're a small group of social scientists. So some of us are genetic counsellors who also work as academic researchers. Others of us are sort of just social science researchers, so people with backgrounds in things like anthropology. And we work at the Genome Campus, which, as the name would suggest, focuses on genomics and biodata. And we look at the kind of social and ethical implications of sort of genomics. We have a kind of diverse range of projects that kind of look at different ethical issues that kind of arise out of genomics.
Yeah, one of your kind of prominent studies, your DNA Your Say, kind of looks at public attitudes towards genomic data sharing. But I know within that kind of research, you guys used films to kind of communicate to the public. What is kind of the benefit, but also challenges of using film to communicate?
Yeah, we've used films in a range of different survey research in order to kind of engage people. One of the things that we're kind of committed to, kind of going back to a point, is trying to listen to people. So try to get, when we're thinking about the kind of implications of genomics, is to try and understand people's point of view. What do people think? I think, as you've alluded to, in terms of the fact that many people, in a formal setting at least, haven't heard of something like genomics. It can be quite challenging because if you put out a survey about genomics, often all you'll get is people responding who already have quite a high level of engagement or knowledge about genomics. So one of the challenges is then to try and put something out there that's engaging and has a wider reach. And one of the ways that we've approached this is to create kind of videos that are both kind of informative but also engaging, and kind of present the subject matter in ways that is quite accessible, so that anybody who is watching those, if they have no background in genomics, so they haven't heard about it, or even if they thought they don't care, can pick up that, watch it, and the aim has always been that the videos kind of can stand on their own right. So they're interesting, engaging videos that just happen to be part of a survey. So the idea was always been that the videos, would work, and this is kind of reflected in the fact that they've quite a few of them have won kind of some awards at film festivals, and that's a reflective of the approach, is that they should be interesting in their own right and engaging in their own right, and then you just happen to tag a survey on the end of them, and that's a no. Then you actually can start to get people's views. In terms of the challenges, I mean, one thing is it's time. That there's an investment in terms of resources. These things are time consuming to make and put together. Worth it, but there's a resource element. And I guess as well, in terms of those videos also will, be framing how then people are approaching the subject matter, because you're given these videos. So, you can think about that as a kind of methodology. But the primary goal has always been to use them to increase the accessibility of the research, and to then, get as wider perspectives as we can on these important issues.
Yeah, I know that the surveys have obviously been translated as well into quite a few different languages. What is kind of the importance of kind of research and education being translated into other languages to kind of ensure that there is accessibility there? Why was that something that was like important to you guys, and kind of what could other kind of groups and researchers do to ensure that there is wider accessibility?
Yeah, so I mean, I think accessibility in genomics, I mean, there's a couple of reasons why it's really important. I think there's a kind of both a sort of practical and an ethical aspect to it. So in terms of just kind of the aim of the research is to allow for the kind of public's voices to be heard as much as possible, particularly in terms of thinking about kind of policy. So the Your DNA Your Say survey was looking at data sharing in genomics. And obviously this is something that's going to be affecting lots of people who are increasingly having genomic testing either as research or in clinical setting, or even in a kind of direct to consumer setting. So it's really important, if you are going to be arguing that these are representative opinions of people, and therefore it should be kind of influential in kind of policy and engagement, that you've actually made sure that that is accessible to lots of different people. Otherwise it's just a small group of people having their say. So there's a kind of ethical imperative there in terms of widening that kind of participation. There's also an issue in genomics where we know that many of the data sets that we are using have an ethnic bias, which then gets translated into the results of genetic testing having a higher predictive value for people of different ethnicities, which is an issue. So, for example, if you're using something like a polygenic risk score to predict, cancer screening programs, it's a challenge if those polygenic risk scores have been developed using genomic data sets that have limited pool size in terms of the ethnicities that were involved. So I think there's also an issue in terms of kind of the wider engagement in terms of genomics. I think a challenge going forward with genomics is to think about kind of building trust in particular, and making sure that the benefits of genomics are for everybody and not just for a smaller group of people depending on your background. So it feeds into a kind of that wider point as well in terms of making sure that we maximize the benefits of genomics for everybody, in terms of trying to understand what people think and feel about DNA, and particularly in terms of that survey, in terms of data sharing and how they want their genomic data used. Is really important, and that is translated and that we get as kind of as wide a range of views as possible from many different people from many different countries and cultures.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think a lot of studies kind of say like public, and then it's not really the public, because it's not got that wider kind of representation of like diverse populations. But in terms of kind of public understanding, I think a lot of people's kind of ideas and opinions comes from things that they've seen within popular culture.
Yeah.
How do you think popular culture has kind of shaped public understanding of genetics and genomics?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it's one of the things I'm really interested in. So, I could talk for ages on it. So, I'll try and keep it pithy and concise. I think one of the ways that popular culture has shaped our opinion is that it gives people a way of expressing their feelings about science. So I think this is particularly true for genomics, but I think it's true in general, is that I think there's often an anxiety, I think, amongst some people when they're approaching popular culture and science, in that it's sort of sensationalist, and that it leads to kind of unrealistic or false fears about science. And I'm not saying that science in film is always necessarily true, but I think one thing that actually we can think about popular culture is it's not necessarily causing public fears, but it's kind of perhaps reflecting them. So these anxieties are there anyway about, especially kind of new sciences, as sciences, you often sort of see science being portrayed in film as something to be scared of when it's kind of new or experimental science. We think of something like AI or genomics, or something that's kind of new, perhaps unregulated, kind of pushing the boundaries. Often then it finds its way into popular culture, in particular into these kind of sort of narratives where it's presented as perhaps something that's quite scary. And I think that's it's a reflection of feelings about science that's kind of they're not going to go away if we just kind of pretend that they're not there. So these are real feelings that kind of people have. So I think one of the values of popular culture is it allows us to engage with people and engage with how they're feeling about science, and to take those feelings and emotions seriously, and not to kind of dismiss them. And it's quite hard, I think, to engage with science perhaps when there's an asymmetry of knowledge, when you've got scientists who know so much, perhaps people who don't know quite so much. I think one of the values of popular culture is that it can kind of even it out, and it can facilitate this kind of conversation where you can have a talk about science and in a way where everyone's kind of got a reference point, and everyone's got kind of something where they feel they can kind of contribute. And I think in particular popular culture can facilitate us talking about our feelings and emotions about science, which is one of the ways that we kind of reason and think about them. You have to take those seriously, even if you feel that those might be unwarranted. You don't get rid of someone's fears about something by, it's very hard to reason somebody out of a fear. It's very hard to rationalize someone out of a fear. Actually, you have to deal with the emotion itself. And that's one of the ways I think popular culture can really help us in a kind of broader science engagement point.
How do you think that we can kind of harness harness popular culture to improve like science communication? Because as you said, like I think a lot of people's associations with kind of genetics sometimes can be negative because of popular culture, so like films in terms of like eugenics and stuff like that. And I don't know how can we harness it in the future to ensure that kind of not to kind of, as you said, remove those fears, but kind of build on that and ensure that there is kind of like a more not accurate representation. But I don't know how could we kind of like combine those kind of things to kind of improve how we communicate with the public, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging question. I don't have a necessarily a complete answer because it's something I'm kind of still working on and still thinking about and still researching. So I've got some ideas, but they are kind of ideas. One of the things that we feel strongly about, I think all of us who work at the Society and Ethics group, is that we need a strong evidence base for anything that we're doing, but particular kind of the science engagement. So it's something that we're kind of looking into and kind of thinking about different ways of researching. But one of the ways I think one of the values of popular culture, I think, is and again, this is going to sound a bit like a broken record. This is probably the genetic counselling training coming out of me. I think it can help. It helps you listen to different people with different perspectives. And I think engagement, real meaningful engagement is quite time consuming, and it takes quite a lot of commitment to really kind of establish those relationships and establish the trust. And I think one of the ways that you establish relationships and trust with people is that you take seriously what they've got to say, even if you disagree with it, even if you think, oh, this person doesn't understand the science, or they've overblown this fear, or that fear is just from the film, it's not really true. I think you have to take seriously what people are saying, take what they're feeling about it, science seriously. If they're scared about it, engage with that. So I think one of the ways that popular culture can be used is it has potential to help people create environments where they feel they can express themselves, they can talk about what they think, what they feel, that they're not going to be judged for that they're going to be listened to. And I think if you do that, then you start to create space for really meaningful engagement. And I think once you have properly listened to people, you're in a better position to then explain your point of view and reasonably expect that to be listened to. So you talk about the kind of the genomics aspect. Let's say that you're perhaps trying to allay someone's fears about the use of a genomic technology. So let's say you're in a position as a scientist trying to persuade people the need and safety of genetically modified foods, for example, which I think there's a kind of an instinctual kind of anxiety around GM foods. I think if you are in that position and you want to kind of talk to people and say, look, actually these foods are not only safe, but in terms of environmental reasons or whatever, we actually need these technologies. I think if you want people to kind of engage, because essentially you're trying to build trust. If you want people to engage with you and really listen and accept what you're trying to say, you need to have listened to them and accept what they've got to say too. And I think popular culture has a potential value there in allowing people to talk and express their emotions. And I think I would argue that if we try and switch it around from thinking not how does popular culture help us communicate, but how does it help us listen, I guess would be a kind of underlying point.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think popular culture kind of is like a platform to allow everyone to kind of join in the discussion. You mentioned trust. Now, I think we've kind of seen with like coronavirus and the rollout of the vaccine, like how important communication is. But how do you think that ineffective communication can kind of hinder like kind of moving forward, or for example in the case of like coronavirus, impact vaccine rollout? But in terms of like more like in relation to genetics, how do you think ineffective communication can be detrimental in that regard?
I mean, I think that's a really important point. I think the whole coronavirus pandemic has highlighted that effective science communication is a key strategy in terms of maximizing the benefits of our scientific knowledge, because we can do all the studies we like to prove that social distancing and mask wearing and lockdowns are effective and necessary. But if you get that messaging wrong and people don't believe it, then the scientific knowledge is not actually being operationalized. It's not benefiting anybody. I think in terms of how to maintain trust, I think we've seen in the pandemic some examples, particularly of how not to do that. And I think one of the challenges with trust is that once it's gone, it's very hard to build back up. And I think one of the ways that we do that in genomics, one of the things that's really important in genomics, in taking it back to genetic counselling, is setting expectations and being realistic and honest about expectations, because that's a really important thing where we're talking about the value of genetic tests and being reasonable about what the test can and can't tell you, and just kind of managing those expectations, because that's something that's really important in terms of kind of maintaining that trust, maintaining credibility, maintaining the honesty. And I think sometimes we may have seen in the coronavirus where people have wanted to perhaps overplay the benefits of certain technologies, or perhaps underplay the risks, and then when the truth comes out, actually that trust is undermined. Whereas perhaps if those realistic expectations were set up at the beginning, so let's say if it was set up at the beginning, that the vaccines, there would be a attendant risk, as any medical technology was. Perhaps then, when it comes out that there are some small risks associated with the vaccines, there's that kind of expectation has been kind of raised, and people are kind of aware of it, and then there's people then kind of I think that facilitates trust. I think it's harder to do that on a global scale. I think when you're in a one-to-one relationship in a genetic counselling consultation, that's a very different kind of situation to trying to do public engagement on a kind of global scale around something so difficult as kind of something like vaccines. But I think the idea of setting expectations is really important.
I think that kind of social media plays like a really, really big part within communication, but how can we ensure that we kind of reach kind of different populations and kind of those communities who don't necessarily typically engage with genetics and genomics, to kind of ensure that everyone is a part of the conversation and we're not kind of excluding and kind of missing like certain populations out? How can we ensure that we kind of rebuild that trust, or like build trust even if it's not there, and kind of engage all populations essentially?
That's such a great question. It's such a good question. I don't necessarily, I'm not going to have a complete answer, because it's such an important point. And I think being able to reach diverse populations and engage them and start building trust is a really important, as we've talked about before, really important aspect of engagement in genomics, but also a really challenging thing. I think one of the things I'd say to that is that building trust and building those relationships, I think it's very challenging to do that with kind of like sort of one-off events. I think it requires a kind of a commitment, kind of quite a deep commitment to kind of that kind of long-term engagement. I think it goes back. I mean, if I can relate it back to kind of genetic counselling, there's this idea that comes out from genetic counselling that is born of its roots in kind of the psychotherapeutic thinking of Carl Rogers, who was a psychotherapist who was very influential in early genetic counselling and still is. And Carl Rogers had this idea of putting the kind of what he called the kind of therapeutic alliance at the centre of genetic counselling. And the idea is that with the counsellor and the patient or client, as sometimes the Americans say, is the key issue to that is kind of having this alliance, having this relationship, and building rapport and building trust. And from a counsellor point of view, it's kind of having this kind of unconditional positive regard and this kind of empathy, and through that you build trust. While that is perhaps quite kind of a resource heavy way of approaching it, if you are able to do that, you are in a position where you can affect the most amount of change, most amount of positive change. I think the same probably holds true for public engagement. There needs to be empathy, there needs to be kind of an unconditional positive regard, where you're not going to dismiss people's fears, you're not going to dismiss people's beliefs, even if you think that they're unscientific. You need to understand that, have an understanding of kind of where they're coming from. And if you are able to build those kind of trusting relationships, you are then in a much stronger position to actually start to affect change in a way that you would want, to start to build those trust back up within where trust maybe has been lost, hasn't existed within genetics, genomics, or sciences as a whole, and start to then be in a much better position to build those relationships.
How do you feel like your kind of the research that you do at the Wellcome Genome Campus and your kind of like your interest in popular culture and those kind of areas have kind of impacted or maybe complemented your role as a genetic counsellor?
So I mean, I sort of hope that there's a kind of symbiosis between genetic counselling and the research work. I think the work I've done through kind of my research work, I think has kind of broadened my perspectives on terms of kind of what you can let into a clinical consultation, in terms of trying to understand where a patient is coming from. I think before I did my research, I was did clinical genetic counselling work, and I went away, did my PhD, and then I've kind of come back and I've kind of do a bit of both now. And I think before I did my research, I think I had perhaps a narrower conception, especially of kind of what that kind of counselling aspect of genetic counselling would be. And I think the research has kind of given me the kind of confidence to have a more varied view of what that counselling aspect of the role would be, in particular kind of the experiences and the knowledges and the views that I kind of will kind of bring into clinical consultations to try and understand where a patient is kind of coming from.
Yeah, I think communication in general is so like important. It's obviously very important in your role, and I think going forward, I think genetic counsellors are just going to be so important as genomics becomes kind of more integrated into society, because they're kind of the bridge between the patients and the kind of science. And I think their role is just going to be so important. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thanks for having me.
It's okay. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, if you enjoyed this video, then make sure you check out some of our other videos in our series by subscribing below or going to our website frontlinegenomics.com. I hope you enjoy.